Hi, everyone. I'm Valerie.
Hi, Valerie.
Welcome so much for coming to our talk tonight on bird habitats at Byrne Preserve. I do want to point out the things that we have showing here on our cover page right now. Um, a bird box with an amazing Western bluebird on top. Some volunteers who have been absolutely integral volunteers and the community to the process that we've been doing in habitat restoration at Byrne Preserve. Down here, little old me speaking to a group of hikers, learning about our floodplain restoration project. And over here, some mule's ear, which is a naturally occurring native, which is always so exciting for us to see in a field of invasives, able to be resilient amongst a lot of competition. My name is Valerie, and I'm the project lead with Grassroots Ecology that's been managing the habitat restoration projects in Los Altos and Los Altos Hills. I've been doing that with the community since 2016, and I feel really fortunate to have seen a lot of the progress on these projects and to coordinate with our partners to get this kind of work done. I've physically been there doing the work as well, weeding, planting, watering, and educating all who give me the honor of their time, including all of you. And today we'll be discussing the legacy of different beings' involvement with Byrne Preserve in a super general and very concise, over tens of thousands of year time frame. So I do apologize for the fact that I'll not be able to include really important details in this really abbreviated natural history, but I hope to set the stage for conversation on why habitat was in decline to require artificial bird boxes in this space. After me, we'll hear from Emily Sharp, who is our restoration specialist that currently prioritizes and manages all the fieldwork done on the ground with our habitat restoration teams. Presently, the way that we do this is during a global pandemic, is every week with our winter cohort of 3 college interns and 10 high school stewards. Shout out to these volunteers and all volunteers past who have committed their most precious resource, their time and their energy, furthering these restoration practices at Byrne Preserve. Emily will be focusing on our talk today about the monitoring methods we use to examine what effect our artificial structures, our bird boxes, have to the local environment. And finally, we'll close our talk with Shelley, our staff ecologist, who is our resident expert on all things watersheds, insects, and ecological interactions within the local, at least 100-mile radius. She'll be focusing her talk on the essential ecological functionings that doing habitat restoration can reinstate in our local open spaces. So, welcome to Byrne Preserve. I wish we could all be there together in person, walking around, maybe not at this time of day, but outside in the actual space itself. But I really do have so much gratitude for all of your presence today and your interest in hearing what we have to say about birds at Byrne. For those of you who haven't been here, and even for those who have, I'll start our talk out today by focusing all of our very varied experiences to give some natural history context on this particular corner of the world that is especially special to me. Also try my best to convince you to visit this relatively quiet open space for your next wander through the woods if you seek some, I think, really spectacular views and engaging hills. So Bird Preserve is in Los Altos Hills, California. It is off the 280 in the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's a public open space, and it does have domesticated horses that roam on the land. Right next door is Westman Community Los Altos Hills open space, right up here. It is 88 acres in totality, and it has ecosystems including rolling grassland and hilly woods with a usually dry creek that runs through it. And you'll have to forgive me for the not current pictures of Byrne Preserve. Unfortunately, we did not get a very consistent flow this year that made Byrne look like this in particular. And by no means do I want to falsely advertise at all, but having technology at my fingertips, I did want to get this chance to depict the full picture of Byrne Preserve as opposed to the snapshot that we would get if we were out in the field together. Okay, well, I can't go back. Don't know how to do that. So this creek is the northeastern headwaters of Moody Creek, which is a part of the Adobe Creek watershed. I mentioned this because I really do appreciate the fact that habitat restoration work at Byrne Preserve has a really big impact on the land itself, but it also has a huge impact northward, down the watershed, through Los Altos and Palo Alto into the San Francisco Bay. So in Byrne Preserve, in addition to a naturally occurring creek that nestles between a sweet little valley, there are also 3 storm drains that feed into it. One from Altamont Road, a sweeping neighborhood street which borders Byrne Preserve northward, and 2 from the neighboring horse farm. So I just want you to keep that in mind because, of course, these storm drains have a direct impact on when it comes to additional runoff and what's being collected in our public waterways. This seasonal creek, I'll call the tributary, meets Moody Creek in the woods. Cue slide change, which goes to Hidden Villa, a wonderful education farm where it turns into Adobe Creek. A lot of place setting. So let's put us up on a map. Byrne Preserve is outlined in red here to orient you. As I said, Adobe Creek runs through Los Altos and Palo Alto into the bay. And as I said, we have a huge impact northward into the bay, but as I'm about to mention, it has a huge impact westward to the Pacific Ocean. So as you see here, between the green and the gray, Byrne Preserve is jutted up against development in one of the tech hub of the world. But nevertheless, Byrne Preserve is also connected through a series of open spaces, conservation easements, and wildernesses that persist through the Santa Cruz Mountains, connecting Silicon Valley to the Pacific Ocean through a wildlife corridor. So mountain lions, bobcats, raptors, they're still all at Byrne Preserve at the top of our food chain, as long as you don't count us humans. And that speaks volumes, I think, on the ecological functioning below them. I think another important note to mention is that Byrne Preserve has an interesting confluence of both urban and wild influence. So you may see birds there that are familiar to you in your backyard, but also very indicative of wild, grand open spaces. So that's all to say, the potential is there. But of course, with invasive species, anthropogenic development, often with impervious, impenetrable surfaces, a depletion of groundwater from decades of agricultural land cultivation, orchards, vineyards, the list goes on. A lot of human-made negative impacts to the ecological functioning surrounding Byrne Preserve has brought us to the work that Grassroots Ecology is doing today. But of course, we cannot mention natural history anywhere on this continent without honoring the communities who tend and shape the ecology of this space, making it into what we see today. Byrne Preserve is on the traditional land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. I feel really lucky at Grassroots Ecology to continue land stewardship with the community, focusing our efforts at Byrne Preserve on the restoration of California riparian and grassland habitat. We've been partnering with the town of Los Altos Hills since 2014, so on site with our model of community engagement alongside habitat restoration for about 7 years now. And we've also been partnering with Valley Water through a few different grants since 2016. We focus our efforts along the creek in Byrne Preserve, which again, the northeastern headwaters of the Moody Creek tributary, kind of a big deal. And it does run, although irregularly, annually. Remember, we do have a few additional anthropogenic inputs to the system, the neighborhood streets and the horse farm next door. So with horses grazing on the land and a total change in landscape when it comes to native grasslands typicality, one way we've combated consistent erosion along the creek is through willow staking. So this is an example just of one way that we've made a barren space with little long-lived vegetation into a more welcoming environment for critters to find home and food. Willows are a plant like many other waterside plants that are able to grow vegetative clones from their mother plant through just a cutting that ends up tumbling downstream. So this is an adaptation that supports spreading populations without requiring seeds or pollination. These plants have really deep roots that ensure willow populations can flourish all year round, so long as they're able to get through that, as you can tell in the picture, decently rough start in the beginning of their lives. And of course, Grassroots Ecology staff and volunteers help them through that really rough time. So right here is a section of creek and how it looked prior to any willow stakes and any cuttings that we hammered into the ground with volunteers. And here it is one year after with a bundle and some more stakes starting to establish. And here's how it looked last summer. You always want to compare summer to summer as opposed to spring to summer in 2020. So doing great in my book. There's this saying in restoration that I've heard before. It goes, if you build it, they will come. And for me, watching these willows grow up in their lifetimes so far, they really have brought a lot of life to them. For example, there's consistent evidence of a multitude of pollinators that at this specific time of year are literally buzzing in droves around the willow flowers. And also we found some evidence of teenage male deer coming to use the willows to scratch the velvet off of their antlers on these willows. And the creek has also responded really positively as well. Water slows down through these sections with willows, sediment settles into the ground, reducing erosion, sinking and keeping water where we need it the most, instead of scouring and going faster, deepening the channel and causing more and more erosion. And that's the power of, 2-inch wide stakes sawed off of a willow branch, hammered into the ground with a ton of volunteers. It's the start of a better functioning waterway ecosystem. Adjacent to the creek, we have a couple of floodplain restoration projects that are historically seepy or wet sections of lands along the creek and between the heavily wooded hills and the rolling grassy oak savanna. These sections have an obvious freshwater influence, and they're where we focus on installing a majority of our container plants. If you haven't heard already, we do have a wonderful nursery that is open to the public for orders, that is supported by staff who collect and nurture watershed-specific seed to repopulate our restoration sites and plants that already have the genetic makeup to be resilient in this specific biome. So here's an example of an area we've had a lot of success in removing invasive species. First by hand, and then by sheet mulching, and finally by revegetating with native plants that, with our help of reduced competition from natives, can finally settle back in where they truly belong. So in the 88 acres of Byrne Preserve, we're especially focused along the creek. There's a lot of potential there. There's a really great, the urgent need, ultimately in an exposed grassland with limited money when it comes to doing large-scale restoration. It's also close enough to the singular spigot that we can ensure watering happens every single summer. Nevertheless, there's plenty to do all across the greater grasslands. We hand remove thistles, including purple and yellow star thistles. This is a depiction of purple star thistles being removed on one hillside in the area. These are really aggressive and they outcompete just, same spiel when it comes to invasive species. They are aggressive, they outcompete for space, water, and nutrients in the soil. They've evolved in a space where they had to have a more aggressive life cycle, which isn't so adjacent with the somewhat comparatively delicate natives. We're younger, evolutionarily speaking. We also mow by hand with weed whips and scythes, and we provide mowing recommendations, including timing, species, and area to the town of Los Altos Hills for yearly multi-acre large tractor mows. So, oh goodness. Squirrel is not my friend right now. Excuse me. The reduction of invasive plants has been a huge support to native population regrowth. There's been a number of native species we've been able to see thrive and spread despite no additional support for us in the grasslands. By no additional support, I mean no additional water, no planting, no seeding, just weeding all the competitive invasives that involved with aggressive life cycles compared to California natives. And they got brought over here by no malicious intent of their own, just good old humans not realizing the extent of their actions, and they end up thriving in our amazing Mediterranean environment. So these all-encompassing, really aggressively spreading fields of invasive plants, they displace insects who just don't know how to work with these foreign plants or how to digest them. And without insects, we don't have any, for example, insect catching birds. So of course, everything, as we all know, is connected. When invasive plants crowd out, excuse me, when invasive plants are there too, they also crowd out native plants that can provide seeds at every time of the year, including drabbled California winter time, which is so essential for cavity nesting birds who are non-migratory. If their place that they call home isn't somewhere that they can forage for food, they'll move on to a richer environment that can provide that or not even be able to survive. So just some plants native plants that we've been able to see recover in the grassland include California poppy, narrowleaf milkweed, a host plant for monarch butterflies, a species of true concern, soap plant, California buttercup, mule's ear, lupine, owl's clover, fiddleneck, creeping wild rye, yampa. Am I bragging? It's a really wide slew of native wildflowers and grasses. I can't take full credit for it because honestly, Byrne Preserve just has the rich native seed bank that really just needs the help from anthropogenic decline and anthropogenic rise to help them out of removing those competitive invasives. So in addition to the diversity reinstating itself, which has both aesthetic and ecological value, the trails aren't so thorny anymore. The horses that live on site have plenty more forage, which I also would say is a really big plus and also very important for corners of the world that we are able to preserve, but of course have different uses of the land, sharing land amongst different foci. In conclusion, we focus our work on invasive species removal, of course, everywhere to begin. And then depending on the specific site, the aspect, the location, we support the native plants that are already brooding, already underground, waiting for their chance to come right up, or we install container plants to help that process a little faster. And adjacent, what seems like it may be not totally directly related, but of course absolutely is, we also manage a series of bird boxes on a few different legs. So this picture I actually am quite proud of. I took it just this past April in 2020. I'm going to pass the mic over to Emily after we field some questions if we have any.
Awesome, thank you, Val. Thanks for setting the scene of Byrne. I've yet to be out there this spring, but I can't wait to go. Let's see, we've got one question. What was the name of the native milkweed next to the poppies?
Narrowleaf milkweed. They're not quite next to each other, at least on site. The narrowleaf milkweed likes to be closer to the creek and in the shade more so, whereas we can find poppies. If you're driving along Altamont and you've been past a few times the past years, there's a great stand of poppies, but they're in the open, a bit more space.
Thank you. All right, I don't see any more questions right now, but remember you can always put questions. Oh, there's one right now. Are those the milkweeds that monarchs love?
Absolutely, they're the one and only host plant for that migratory insect.
That's perfect. I think we might hear a little bit more about that later. Oh, any other native milkweeds?
No.
Not at Byrne, but there are others in the state.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. We have a showy milkweed. All right, great. All right, great. So let's move on to Emily Sharp, who's going to talk about the nesting box program.
Awesome, thank you, Hannah. And thanks so much to Valerie for setting the scene at Byrne for us, introducing us to some of the different restoration techniques that we employ in the preserve. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the bird species that we help to support with our restoration work. And I want to say that there are so many different bird species that we could focus on in this talk. But we're going to narrow our focus today and talk about one specific group of birds, and those are the cavity nesting birds. So these are California native birds. They build their nests in natural cavities. That includes hollow trees, dead or fallen trees, as well as in cavities left by woodpeckers as they're making holes. So this is actually an oak tree at Byrne Preserve that's being used as an acorn granary by acorn woodpeckers. So that's an excellent example of how these natural cavities are created in natural oak woodlands and oak savannas, like the ecosystems we have at Byrne. So as old growth forests have been lost to deforestation, habitat for these birds has declined pretty significantly. Additionally, dead trees are often removed from our neighborhoods and other open spaces for different reasons. Some of those are aesthetic. A lot of times humans just don't like the way those trees look in their yards. Another reason is fire safety in areas where we're concerned about wildfires. But that it has a negative effect on the native birds that are used to using those kinds of trees for habitat. So one of the ways that we mitigate that loss of habitat is to install and maintain nest boxes for bird habitat. So these nest boxes mimic the conditions of a natural cavity and provide a safe place for birds to build nests. So today I'm going to share our monitoring and cleaning practices for these boxes and hopefully give you a few pointers on just generally maintaining bird boxes. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is placing bird boxes. So this is one of our boxes here at Byrne. You can see this is running along Altamont Road, running up against the grassland at Byrne. So when choosing where to install your nest boxes, there are a few factors to consider. The first is obviously that different birds have different habitats. So for example, bluebirds generally hunt for food in grasslands, while chickadees hunt in tree canopies. So it's important for boxes to be situated near food sources for the birds that are going to use them. Bird boxes should be designed for the species that are already found in a certain area or neighborhood. So if you're installing a bird box, you're not really going to attract new species of birds to your area. You're just going to support the birds that are already there and looking for habitat. In terms of placing multiple bird boxes, boxes should be placed at least 30 feet away from each other, but ideally more like 100 feet away from each other. So you can see one box here, and we actually have several boxes along this road. The next one is here, about 100 feet or so away. And finally, the boxes should be mounted about 4 to 6 feet off the ground. So let's talk a little bit about the features that make a good nest box. In general, boxes should be sturdy and unable to move around, even in intense conditions like wind or rain. You can see that this box has an overhang, which is also great for preventing, weather, negative effects from weather like rain. Boxes should be made of wood rather than plastic or other materials. That's best for insulation. And it can be a lot of fun to build bird boxes, to put them together, but they shouldn't have paint or bright colors on the outside. That's just drawing attention to the box and doing a disservice to the family that will be using them. As I mentioned before, if you're going to build a nest box, do some research about the types of birds in your area. So the size of the hole at the front of the box where birds exit and enter should correspond to the size of the bird. So for example, bluebirds use a hole that's about 1.5 inches in diameter. So that'll help protect against larger invasive birds that might want to try to get in the box. In that same vein, you can see here, there is a protruding predator guard on the outside of the box. And that just helps to keep potential predators as far away from the baby birds in the box as possible. You'll also notice that there's no perch on this bird box. The native birds don't need it. They just fly in and out of the box. So that's actually just making it easier for predators to get in there if you have a perch on it. This box also has drainage here at the base. So they're in the 4 corners, there are actually openings that just open to the outside, and that helps any excess moisture to drain out so that mold doesn't accumulate in the box. It's also really nice to have an opening for access to the box. So our favorite way to do that is to have a door on the side with a panel that you can see through into the box. So that makes it really easy to monitor and see what's going on inside the box without having to disturb the birds inside too much. And finally, I wanted to show one more photo. This bird box has a removable platform for cleaning. And I think that makes it a lot easier to keep the bird box tidy. So if you're building one by yourself, that is something you might consider. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit more about the bird boxes that we have at Byrne. We have 13 boxes that were donated to us. They were installed in 2016 and 2017, and their size is designed for bluebirds or birds of a similar size. So like I said, that 1.5-inch hole. We actually also have 2 owl boxes at Byrne. So those are quite a bit bigger and mounted a lot higher. So we don't monitor those on a regular basis, but it is cool that they're there. So as Valerie mentioned, we have 3 kind of ecosystems that we associate with Byrne. And we have sets of bird boxes in each of those 3 ecosystems to support the birds that hunt for food in each of those 3 areas. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on Byrne. So the first ecosystem is the grassland or oak savanna that makes up much of the preserve along Altamont Road. And we have 5 nest boxes that are spaced out along about a 1,000-foot stretch or so along that road. The next ecosystem is the oak woodland. So we have several nest boxes that actually hang on oak tree branches right at the transition of the grassland to oak woodland ecosystem. And finally, Valerie mentioned the tributary that runs down and meets up with Moody Creek through Byrne. So we have 2 nest boxes that are mounted right along the tributary. The ecosystem around them is generally more densely vegetated and wetter than it would be for the other nest boxes. I want to briefly highlight a few of the species that we've observed using our nest boxes at Byrne. So for the western bluebird, violet green swallow, and oak titmouse, we've observed these 3 species building nests in our bird boxes. I also want to include the acorn woodpecker, which is also a cavity nester. We haven't actually seen it building nests in our boxes. We have seen it like depositing acorns into the boxes to store them in there, which isn't really the intent of these boxes, but it's still a really cool native species that we love. So I'll talk a little bit about that one as well. Great, so I'll start with the western bluebird. It's a really fun one to see, especially this time of year with its bright blue feathers and its characteristic orange or rust-colored vest on the front. Like many species, the male bluebirds have more vibrant colors than the females. So that's one feature to look for. You can often find western bluebirds searching for food closer to the ground. So they kind of flutter around the ground more so than soaring through the sky like other birds. And some western bluebirds actually work in groups to care for and feed the chicks. So if one adult bluebird's nest or young doesn't make it for some reason, then that adult might actually go help another couple of birds feed their young. So quite a familial species. The next bird I'll talk about is the violet green swallow, which is another fun, colorful one to look for at Byrne. So you can recognize it by its shimmery green around the head and shoulders, and then its violet feathers. So you'll see these birds flying higher in the sky generally than western bluebirds. So they're more of a soaring species that then dive down to grab their insects or whatever other food they might be grabbing off the ground. The scientific name for this species means fast moving because they do fly really fast, especially for a small bird like this. They've been recorded flying up to 28 miles an hour, which is pretty cool. Next species is the oak titmouse. This one isn't quite as flamboyant or showy with its colors as the first 2 that we talked about. It's smaller and kind of a gray-brown, but you can recognize it usually based on the slight crest that it has on its head, as well as its long feathers. These guys like to make their nests out of really soft and cozy material. So things like grasses and moss and often feathers as well. Oak titmice actually mate for life, so they keep the same partner for their whole life. And they are often found along like dry slopes with oak trees in California. So Byrne Preserve is actually a great habitat for them. And finally, I'll talk about the acorn woodpecker. So you can recognize this guy with his black feathers and distinctive red cap. And as you can see, he has a longer and stronger beak than the first three birds that we talked about. So that gives it the strength to make those holes in the wood to deposit acorns and create that great habitat for other birds as well. About 50% of the acorn woodpecker's diet is acorns. So they spend a ton of time in the fall just hunting for acorns. A single acorn granary tree can hold thousands of acorns, and a single tree can have up to 50,000 of those holes. Awesome. So now that we're familiar with the species that we're working with at Byrne, I'm going to talk a little bit about the bird box maintenance that we do. It is truly a year-round process, although some parts of the year are a little bit more intensive than others. So I want to start in February for this timely talk, because that's the start of nesting season for these birds. And that's also when we begin our regular monitoring. We usually don't observe the first nests in the boxes until March or April, but it's really nice to start monitoring a little bit early because then we can really narrow down to about the week when nests first start to appear. If there are two rounds of nests in the same box during a single season, then it can help to clean the box in between the building of the two nests. So it's important to monitor the boxes to see when the first fledge is, to know if you need to clean during nesting season. We do our monitoring from February to August. So August is when our monitoring season ends. And then we do a big annual cleaning of all the bird boxes, usually in September or October. It's important to do that on the earlier side because birds do start to scope for their spring nesting spots in November and December. And then we start the whole process all over again. So a little bit more on our monitoring regimen. First, I want to address why we monitor, like what we're looking for. And the first reason is really just to understand our ecosystems better and understand what species are making their homes here in these boxes. The second, as I mentioned, is to observe fledging times. That helps us to note when we need to clean the boxes, or if we do during the season. And finally, we want to monitor so that we can avoid providing habitat for invasive species. So there are some invasive bird species in our area, including the European starling and the house sparrow that were introduced. And those species can actually be really aggressive and kill our native birds. So we want to monitor to make sure they're not using the boxes. We want to have a positive impact on our ecosystem and the native species that thrive here. We try to monitor once a week, but every 7 to 10 days from February through August. And there's a bit of a process that we go through. So whenever we're monitoring, we visit each box. We approach it kind of slowly and gently, just in case there are any birds flitting around in and out of the nest. We just don't want to alarm them. If you do see a bird that seems stressed out that you're around the nest, then it's usually best to just come back the next week. It's not really worth stressing them out. But once you've assessed the situation, you can approach the box, and we usually just knock really gently on the side of the box just to let anybody inside know that we're there. And then we open the door to see what's inside. So we keep a monitoring log with the data from each of our monitoring visits to the bird boxes. So we note, of course, the location of each box, but then in each visit, we look to see if there's a nest inside. And if there is a nest, then how many eggs are in it, or how many baby birds. It's important to note the material that the nest is made out of and the colors of the eggs or the birds, because that'll help you get an identification for the types of species that are using the box. We also like to note any behavior that we notice inside. if the birds are eating, if they're making a lot of noise, if there's an adult bird in there as well with the baby birds, anything like that, I think will just help to understand the bird behavior a little bit better. So I want to show you some of the data that we have collected over the past few years that we've been monitoring these boxes. So this graph shows the number of boxes that we have observed being used each year. So there are 11 total boxes that we monitor. And so you can see, I think overall, there's been an upward trend in the number of boxes that have been used since they were installed in 2016 and 2017. This past year in 2020, we observed 8 out of the 11 boxes with a nest in them at some point during the season. As I mentioned, we have groups of boxes in each of the 3 ecosystems at Byrne. So this graph shows the percent of boxes in each ecosystem that we observed to be used in the last nesting season. So for example, this bar shows that about 40% of the boxes in the grassland area were used in 2018. So overall, we've definitely seen an increase in box usage in the grassland and riparian ecosystems over time. The target occupancy for our boxes is about 80%. If we were to observe 100% of the boxes being used, that would be a sign that we should install more boxes. So depending on this year's monitoring data, we may want to consider installing more boxes here in the riparian zone. The oak woodland results have varied a little bit more. These boxes, as I mentioned, they hang from oak trees in the oak woodland. So they're more susceptible to being moved by other animals like horses and deer. And that's something that we've suspected might have happened in the last few years that would cause slightly varying results. Although we have seen about 50% occupancy the last 2 years. So that's great for our oak woodland species. And as for species that use these boxes, we've observed western bluebirds and violet-green swallows in each of the 3 ecosystems. We have noticed oak titmice building nests in the oak woodland boxes that hang from the trees. And we think we might have seen evidence of an oak titmouse in the riparian boxes as well, although I put a maybe here because that's not for sure. Commonly used materials are kind of what you would expect based on the material that's available at Byrne and the ecosystems that are there. So a lot of twigs and grasses, and also lots of horsehair used in the nests, which I think is a really cool example of how the different critters are living together on this land, even though, the horses haven't been here all that long compared to the birds. There are some other things that you'll find in nest boxes in addition to just nests and eggs. As I mentioned before, we've found lots of acorns deposited by woodpeckers. We've also found plenty of mice making homes in our nests. We do usually evict those nests when we find them, so we just take out the material. A lot of those mice are native species, and we do want to support their habitat. But there's a lot of other places where they can make their nests, whereas these cavity nesters are a little bit more particular about their habitat. So we really want to reserve our cavity nesting boxes for the birds that they are built for. You can also definitely expect to find dead birds in your nests when you are monitoring bird boxes. This is natural. It's something to get used to if this is a project that you're going to take on. You might find baby birds that died because something happened to the adults while they were out hunting. You can also find dead adults sometimes. Someone actually advised us that boxes actually offer a safe place for adult birds to die if they need that, if they're exhausted or if something else has happened to them. So I encourage you not to let that scare you off. It's a natural process, and it actually lets you see some pretty cool things like this baby bird skeleton that we found during our 2020 cleaning season. So speaking of cleaning, there is some debate in the bird box community about whether or not to clean bird boxes. Some people argue that in the wild, these cavities wouldn't be cleaned, so they should just be left alone. We choose to clean our boxes because we recognize that we can never exactly imitate a natural habitat with these bird boxes. They're smaller than a lot of cavities in trees, and the same decomposing processes aren't at play to help break down the used material quite as fast as that would happen in the wild. So we like to clear out any old nests or any other things that we find in these boxes in order to make as much room as possible for the next bird families to move in and build their nests. So that's kind of our philosophy, although it's certainly not the only one out there. So as I mentioned, we clean during the nesting season, if necessary, if the birds have fledged kind of in the middle of the season. And then we do a big clean every fall. Really important to remember to wear gloves and a mask as you're cleaning out your boxes. There's a lot of stuff in there that can make humans sick. We remove any nests that we find in the boxes, as well as any other material, any acorns or spider webs or dead birds, whatever else is in there. And then we actually scrub the box down with a solution. So we use a solution of lemon juice, baking soda, and warm water. And we scrub it down pretty well until almost everything is out. And then we just leave the door open for a few days to let it dry out to ensure that no like mold builds up in there. Just important to remember to go back and close the door after a couple of days, or sometimes our helpful neighbors close the doors for us, which we really appreciate. So what's next for our bird box program? Our 2021 monitoring season has started this week. So we haven't observed any nests in there yet, but I'm definitely really excited to keep looking in there over the next few weeks to see what we find. In general, we just always want to continue to improve our processes to support these birds in any way that we can. So as I mentioned before, if we observe, 100% of them being used, that would be a good indicator to us to install more. Or, just continuing to monitor to ensure that these are providing habitat for the native species that we really love supporting. I also wanted to mention that at the end of every monitoring season, we submit our monitoring data to the California Bluebird Recovery Program. That's a statewide program that is supported by local Audubon chapters. So they are keeping track of the bigger impact of cavity nester boxes across the whole state. So I definitely recommend looking into that resource if you want to learn more about the kind of long-term impacts of these boxes, or to see how you can be a volunteer monitor, because that is a role that they have open for boxes that have already been installed. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you joining us. Now that we're talking about larger scale impacts, I'm excited to pass the mic off to Shelley to talk a little bit more about the role of birds on a global scale. But before we do that, I'll take any questions from Hannah.
Awesome, thanks, Emily. I love seeing the impact of those bird boxes that we have, and it's always a fun time cleaning them out. Mostly fun and interesting. Okay, so we do have some questions. I'm gonna back up a little bit. Well, we had a question about where we buy the boxes, or do we make them? Valerie helped answer that volunteers made and donated the bird boxes, but have we ever made them ourselves, or which volunteers have donated them to us, if you know?
This isn't really an answer to the question, but you can find really specific plans online for whatever bird species that you're trying to support. They'll give you the exact dimensions of all the pieces and the whole. So that makes it really easy to plan if you're building your own bird box.
Nice, yeah, and I have a resource that we can share at the end that Audubon has, goes through all of those different steps for bluebirds, if people are interested in that. All right.
It also has instructions on it's in the care of the boxes tab that it talks about how to hang it, whether it's on a pole or in a tree or a bush. They have instructions.
Thanks, Claire.
I have a question. Can I ask a question? I know at Arastradero I went with somebody who was monitoring boxes, and there were house sparrows using some, and they made a really messy bunch of sticks. Is that how you know that they're there, and you remove those when you see them, or is there one of our native species that does that too, and do you have to worry about damaging
That is one of the reasons why Nest ID is a really good thing to get familiar with, because that's an easy way to recognize if invasive species are using your bird boxes. So again, I won't go into the details of each species, but I would encourage you to look it up, because you can find good pictures of the different nests that the different birds build online. That's one of the reasons that we monitor so frequently, like once a week, so that we can remove invasive bird nests before they start to like lay eggs or anything in there, because we wouldn't want to get that far along in the process. So constant vigilance is key in keeping invasive species out.
Nice. We had a question about, do we know if the same birds return to the same box the next year?
We have never done any like tagging or anything like that. There may be some data on that through the California Bluebird Recovery Program. I'm not sure. Val or Shelley, feel free to jump in if you have other knowledge of that. We haven't done any tracking of that at Byrne.
All right. We have someone in the chat who said that his boxes are used by the same bird, so possible. Do we know if oak titmice migrate? From what I know, they stick around year round, but someone is welcome to.
Yeah, if anyone has more information on this than I do, feel free to share it in the chat. I know that like in a natural area, oak titmice, like they mate for life. So generally the partners would defend their territory over multiple seasons. So I think they stay in the same place from season to season. But someone feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, let's do one more and then we'll move on to Shelley. You've kind of talked about this a little bit, but when putting a nest box in a yard, which might be a little different, is it best to hang it on a pole in the open or in a tree or bush?
I would say that, like, speaking from my experience at Byrne Preserve, we've had the best stability when they've been mounted on a pole. And I think that that is good for birds, just to avoid the box being knocked around by animals or weather during the season. So in my experience, that is what I would recommend. But we have had constant success with the boxes that hang in the trees, and we've observed some of the same species using them. So if that is what you have for habitat in your yard, then I would certainly say to do that, and just to take all the precautions you can to ensure that it's installed there pretty securely.
I had somebody email me that question, and I found the paragraph that I put into the chat about the subject, and he confirmed that for him, he's put several boxes in his neighborhood, and the ones that aren't being used, he said, were near his bird feeders. So that's interesting. That fits with what it says here in this paragraph, that avoid placing it near your bird feeder. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's a disease issue, but I don't know why they would choose that. Maybe too many birds coming around. They want more privacy.
Yeah, it is nice to space them out, so they can defend their own territory.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the questions and the answers. Let's move on to Shelley. Shelley, you ready?
Yes. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about how to save birds. And then, I like to talk about it from an ecologist perspective. I'd like to talk about birds, about their ecology on a larger scale. Unfortunately, birds are not doing so well these days, and they're in critical need of our help, or we need to drastically change our practices in order to ensure their survival. And I hope to share with all of you tonight about what steps we can take to save birds. And need to transition. Yes. So why should we care about birds? Birds do a lot of things for our environment they live in. This is a fancy term called ecosystem services, without them, living on this earth would get a lot harder, and it would also get a lot messier. We have many types of birds that live in our region, and they all play different roles in, and their individual actions benefit the ecosystem as a whole. So for example, insect control. 96% of all birds eat insects. We also have the big raptors who control the population of small rodents like ground squirrels and voles. Raptors also instigate a landscape of fear. So if a ground squirrel knows that there is a red-tailed hawk flying around, they would stay hidden in their burrows and they won't venture out to eat vegetation. So in that way, the vegetation is saved from herbivory from the ground squirrel. If we had no hawks doing that, all of our small mammals and our small rodents would rapidly eat all the vegetation that is planted out there. Vultures and crows also help with waste removal. They eat carrion. You might have seen some roadkill being picked off by vultures or crows in the middle of the morning. Some birds are also great at seed dispersal. Many of our native plants produce berries like our elderberries and toyons, and the finches and towhees and the jays really love to eat them and fly away and poop them out somewhere else. And a new toyon or elderberry will form in their poop in the ground. We also have our beautiful hummingbirds that are crucial for plant pollinations. There are certain plants, many of them have red flowers, and their flowers are very, very elongate, meaning that they have like long tubular flowers, and hummingbirds are trained to look for the red flowers to drink nectar from it. And finally, we humans really enjoy birds. It is a multi-billion-dollar ecotourism industry, and without birds, the world would be a lot sadder, honestly speaking. So I have the unfortunate news of telling you guys that within one human generation, we have lost over 2.9 billion birds. 50 years ago, we had almost 3 billion more birds observed than we do today. Scientists have figured this out based on looking at radar. We know that a lot of our North American birds fly south for the wintertime, and our military radars actually pick it up. They pick up migratory birds crossing the Gulf of Mexico into Mexico. And we've been able to track that data year by year. And unfortunately, a lot of those migratory birds are missing today. To paint a clearer picture, not just a certain type of bird is missing, rather many, many different groups of birds are missing. The American sparrows have drastically declined in population. You can read the pie chart. It's all the red. The red color indicates which groups of birds are sadly, their populations are declining over the past 50 years. However, there is a silver lining. Through conservation efforts, we have managed to actually increase certain bird populations as well. For example, if you look at the blue pie chart, these are the groups of birds that we've seen a resurgence or increase in their population. We think that this is due to the banning of DDT. We know that DDT, when it was being used, it was making shell on the eggs really fragile, and when birds would sit on them, their eggs would crack and break. And so a lot of our big charismatic raptors were suffering that way, but so like our bald eagles. But when we banned DDT, a lot of those raptors came back. We also have an increase in ducks and geese and turkey and grouse, and those are all pretty much game fowl. So like maybe a few generations ago, like we were hunting more for food, or we were hunting more for sport. But now with more increased regulations, our government issues certain permits for and heavily regulates hunters' actions and how many birds they can take. Their populations is also resurged. There's also some interesting data that scientists still don't quite understand, but our non-native birds that we've introduced to North America, they're also declining as well. So like the house sparrow, we've seen over 50% decrease in their population compared to 50 years ago. And yeah, there's still a big question mark as to why that is, but I find that really interesting. So scientists have pointed out that habitat loss and degradation is the sole driver for the loss of these birds. I kind of want to define habitat for a minute. Habitat is a location where a living thing has everything it needs to live, grow, and reproduce. Habitat can be broken down into 4 categories: food, shelter, water, and space. And so different living things have different needs based on their biology. If you take, for example, I'll give myself as an example, I'm a modern day city dwelling human. For food, I need to live near a supermarket, or I need to live near a restaurant or a cafe. Shelter, I need a home, a room, an apartment to live in. Water, I need clean drinking water that comes out of the taps. And space, like school for learning. I need a park to go and exercise, to recreate. I need shops to go and socialize and hang out with friends. That is habitat for me. So if you translate that to a bird, you can kind of see what they need in order to thrive. And when you break it down into these 4 different categories, if any of these 4 categories are lacking, then we will begin to see a decline in livability. So if we have less food, we will have less birds. We have less foods for birds, we will have less birds. And tonight, Val and Emily did a great job of talking about 3 out of the 4 requirements for bird habitat: the shelter, water, and space. I want to talk about the last one, the food. So to repeat myself, 96% of all birds rely on insects for food. Insects are a great source of protein and are essential for survival, especially to baby birds. You can see in this photo, there's a Western bluebird feeding its offspring a nice, juicy caterpillar. A young chick still cannot break open seeds because it doesn't have like the strength to, with its beak, to tear anything. So it relies on its parent to shove soft, easily digestible insects that are rich in fat and proteins down its throat. A parent is really busy when it's raising its young. One baby chick needs to be fed on average about 10 minutes during, like every 10 minutes during the day. So if you're a parent, you're going back and forth trying to feed this little baby so that it will survive and grow up on its own, and hopefully will learn how to feed itself. Unfortunately, there is a common misconception that birds only eat seeds, because we see a lot of birds at bird feeders and we always feed them seeds. Or hummingbirds only drink nectar from flowers, or robins only eat worms. But birds have a much more varied diet, and there needs to be a whole biodiverse selection of insects for them to find and hunt and eat as well. Birds need to look for beetle larvae on the ground. Sometimes you might see towhees like scritching at the ground to look for little grubs, beetle larvae, or worms. We have flycatchers that look for insects that are in the air, like flies and gnats and maybe some bees. And especially the parent birds who are looking for small, juicy morsels for their chicks, they are looking for caterpillars. I think caterpillars are one of the most nutritious insects that a baby bird can eat. So hopefully I brought this connection, I solidified this connection that birds need insects to survive, especially native insects. And once again, I have to be the bearer of bad news that insects are also on the decline. More and more research has been published This one came out just this January of this year. It's a review paper reviewing insect declines or lack of declines around the world. And it is unfortunately more decline than increase. Insects are by far the most populous animal living on this planet. They are specialized to be super abundant, right? People think, the insects will never go extinct, right? They're everywhere. Like, I've been swatting mosquitoes all the time, things like that, right? They have really short life cycles. When they reproduce, they reproduce a lot of them, and they're also found almost everywhere. Unfortunately, looking at previous data that we've collected in the past, maybe one human generation ago, compared to today, we've noticed that in certain areas around the world, insect populations are declining. And again, it's also not just one species of insect that is declining. If it was only one species of insects, we can probably ramp up our conservation efforts and try to bring it back. However, many of them are declining. And this should be super worrisome because that means our ecosystem is not functioning, our ecosystem is not being healthy. Entomologists or insect biologists have kind of pinpointed that not one thing is inhibiting insects from thriving, rather than it's a whole slew of things that humans have done, both intentionally and unintentionally, that are causing insects to not really have a good time on this planet. Take, for example, climate change. If you have a rapidly changing climate, you'll have more frequent, more larger natural disasters like fires and hurricanes. These big catastrophic events usually results in a lot of loss of life, and insects usually can jump back up from that. However, if we have like a massive wildfire year after year after year, it's pretty hard to come back from a lot of destruction that way. We also, in the modern day, we have basically industrialized our agricultural system. We've basically deforested a lot of areas, or we've planted monocultures of a single type of crop. And we've used a lot of herbicides and pesticides to spray those crops in order to get a good yield. And unfortunately, a lot of those chemicals have drifted over and negatively impact insects as well. Livestock raising, just think about Brazil and how they are ramping up their industrialization of meat packing and beef production. They're cutting down the Amazon rainforest and stealing land from indigenous groups over there in order to have more cows and sell more meat. Also urbanization as well. When we urbanize, we give more space for humans, but most of the time our cities are not inclusive to a lot of other wildlife. Instead, we like to form our own landscapes. We have nurseries that bring in non-native trees and non-native shrubs because they flower well or they're pest-free. And most of the time they become invasive when they escape into the wildlands. With urbanization, we unfortunately also have pollution from energy generation of non-renewable resources to using gas combustion cars. And also urban landscaping is also pretty intensive. Like, we've always had this notion that insects are bad. We must keep our lawns immaculate and our leaves free of holes and free of nibbles from insects. And we have also overused pesticides and overused water and overused fertilizers as well. And so all of these factors have negatively impacted our native insect populations here. And if we're seeing insects that are declining, we are also going to see fewer birds as a result as well. So that means in order to save birds, we need to save the insects, and we need to create habitat for insects. And again, I would like to focus on the food that insects eat. They primarily eat plants. Insects are usually thought of as animals that are at the bottom level of the food chain. What's really important to know is that many of our native insects have co-evolved with native plants to eat them. So the most extreme examples are butterflies. Many caterpillars of certain species of butterflies will only eat one species of plant, like the monarch caterpillar will only eat the milkweed, or the checker spot will only eat monkey flower or bee plant, things like that. Other insects are more generalists, so they can either like eat all types of plants or specialists or very few plants. And that is why it is really important to preserve intact ecosystems. This is Byrne. It is an intact woodland ecosystem. What I mean by preserve, I really mean the land. There is this large misconception that preserves are wild spaces untouched by humans, and that we humans, the only time we go into a preserve or what we impact on it is always negative. That is simply not true. Humans as a species, we've lived in quote unquote preserved ecosystems for most of our species existence. Take, for example, the local indigenous tribes, the Ohlone people. They utilize traditional land management strategies like propagation of native plants for food, the harvesting of acorns, prescribed burns to manage these ecosystems to produce more biodiversity as a result. And so with that vein, Grassroots Ecology, we want to foster good land stewardship as well, because we know that without humans and good land stewardship, open spaces will not thrive. And so shout out to our college interns this past fall. This is the 3 of them. And we were planting buckeye nuts in this dried tributary in hopes that a few of these nuts will grow into buckeye trees and provide more habitat for insects and birds. We also want to inspire others to appreciate nature. Appreciating nature for its beauty, to learn more about nature. When we do that, we can find within ourselves to prioritize conservation and good land stewardship. This is a photo, I think it happened a year or 2 ago, pre-COVID, but we usually have monthly hikes. This was a night hike at Byrne, I believe. The second point that we can do is that we can restore urban landscapes. As humans, we live in an urban area. We live in the city. For the most part, cities in the Bay Area were built with the self-interest of humans and industry in mind and did not really plan cities for wildlife. For the most part, we've kept our native wildlife out of our cities. However, there are some efforts being made to restore some of that lost biodiversity. I don't really have time to talk too much about this, but this is a lovely report that was published by SFEI, Reyoking Silicon Valley. It is a really beautiful report to read, but this is a proposal to cities and municipalities in the Bay Area to consider urban habitat restoration. Specifically the restoration of the once great oak woodland that dominated the valley floor. If you want to look at the graphs with me, the top pie circle is basically the native forest pre-colonialization, pretty much, like before the gold rush, when there were more indigenous peoples than white settlers that were in California at that time. A lot of the canopy was dominated by native oaks, almost over 80%. And then the other trees also supported a biodiverse life as well. Now, when you look at the bottom pie chart, this is the species of trees that dominate, or not so dominate, that cohabitate the valley floor today. We have over 400 different species, and only 4% of them are native. The rest of them are pretty much non-native introduced species. So you might think, yes, more species of trees, more insects, right? Biodiversity yield more biodiversity. Unfortunately, that is wrong. A lot of these non-native species are not habitat for native insects. They unfortunately don't provide food for our native insects because our native insects have not evolved a way to eat them. Take, for example, the Ludden plane tree. It's a beautiful tree. It's a hybrid. They're planted a lot in parking lots to provide shade for cars. It only supports less than 10% of insects. I mean, not 10%, 10 insect species. Also the ginkgo, a lovely non-native tree. Like, it has these beautiful fan-shaped leaves, and their leaves like turn this vibrant yellow color in the fall, and they drop and blanket the floor. It is native to China, but it is not native to the Bay Area, and therefore it only supports one insect species here. Compared to our oak trees, they are considered a keystone species, meaning that they are the backbone to our ecosystem. They not only support themselves, but a lot of other animals and a lot of other plants rely on these oaks to be there for them to thrive. So oaks can provide habitat for over 300 different types of animals, vertebrate animals, so like think birds and mammals, 370 species of fungus. Chanterelles are really nice to find under oaks, just to name a good example. Over 5,000 insect species are found on oaks, thriving off of oaks as well. And not only do oaks provide habitat for animals, they also provide habitat for native plants as well. So over 2,000 species of native plants can be found living underneath oaks as well. And they rely on oaks either for shade or nutrients through the fallen leaves to live. And so back to the birds, I know I've like kind of tangentialized, like went off to rave about oak trees. When you think about if you were a parent bird and you're looking for food to feed your young, if you're looking for insects, it's really easy to find food if you have 5,000 species flying all over you that are utilizing just one type of tree. However, if you are trying to find food in a city with all of these non-native trees and you only find like less than 20 species, it gets much harder to find food and raise your young to adulthood. I also want to say that reforesting urban areas, another added plus is climate change resiliency. We know that climate change is coming and we need to prepare for it. Cities are just going to get hotter and hotter. They are already pretty hot in the summertime because they create these urban heat islands where all the pavement and the concrete, they just heat up a lot hotter than maybe like a forest ecosystem would. And so having oaks to provide shade in communities will not only allow our city to be more climate resilient, but also help us survive. A lot of people unfortunately die from heat stroke over the summertime due to the lack of shade and due to the lack of effective cooling. We're also going to see California maybe become more drier as well. The good thing is that oak trees are very drought tolerant. They have these deep root systems that drill all the way down to the groundwater, like 20 to 40 feet deep, and that's where they can access the groundwater to survive. They also have been known to absorb rainwater. So when thinking about torrential storms that we have in the summertime, in the wintertime, the leaves of the oak trees actually absorb rainwater to prevent runoff and flooding of our streets. And finally, with climate change, we're also expected to see mass extinctions as well. So as a side benefit, like might as well make urban areas become wildlife refuges as well, because we all need to survive in the coming years. I just talked about how like cities and municipalities can bring wildlife back to their cities. Now I want to kind of focus more on like the microcosmic scale, talking about the homeowners and talking about how to landscape with birds in mind. As we all know, birds need bugs and bugs need native plants. And it is very possible to do this in your own yard. Consider planting a native plant garden. This is at Bull Park in Palo Alto. It used to be a really drab lawn that died, and Grassroots and the Bull Park, Eau Claire, I'm sorry, I forgot the Bull Park, Friends of Bull Park.
It's the Bull Park Native Garden crew.
Yes.
in Barron, in the community of Barron Park.
Oh, Barron Park. Oh no, I forgot. Okay,
That's okay.
Barron Park.
It's two park names. It's confusing.
Oh, but they're the same. They're like connected to each other.
Bull
no?
Park is inside Barron Park.
Oh, okay. Now I'm confused. Anywho, yeah, with like community support and getting the neighbors all energized, we basically turned this dead lawn into a vibrant native garden ecosystem. There's flowers blooming year round, which brings all the bugs and all the pollinators, which brings all the birds. Native plants are adapted to our ecosystem here, and so they require much less water if we choose the right types of plants. If you want to learn more, Calscape, owned by the California Native Plant Society, if you go to their website and just type in your street address, they will list out all the native species that are local right on your address. And so that could be kind of inspiration if you were thinking about what things you want to plant next, or if you want to start restoring your garden to make it look beautiful, what native plants would you use and what plants would thrive in your climate and your soil type.
Shelley, Robin Mitchell posted in the chat that Calscape has a way to sort by the number of butterflies hosted, which I didn't realize.
Yes.
So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, they partnered with, I forget what entomology museum, but there's now a database of like which butterflies and moths are what host plants, what California native host plants they have, which I think is also really cool too. So you can even filter to see if you want to have a butterfly garden, what native plants would you put in your butterfly garden? Hopefully see your butterflies with caterpillars come next. Still raving about oaks? If you already have an oak in your property, take care of it. This is a Google Street View of my neighborhood, like 2 blocks away from me. Hopefully no one recognizes where I live. But this is a street view of this majestic valley oak. I recently discovered it this year because I was taking a walk during the pandemic. And this valley oak is huge. I think it's about like 150 years old. The trunk, the girth of this tree is like almost as wide as that minivan, the minivan's width. And so it must have been here way before suburban development, like way before like fruit agriculture that happened in the valley. It must have been here a long time ago. this oak is unfortunately not doing so well. Like the only reason why it's kind of still alive is because it has an established root system that can feed into the groundwater that is still rapidly sinking. But a lot of its like ecosystem and its habitat has been stripped away from it. It's now confined to a parking lot median. So think about its roots, like it can't absorb the rainwater as the rain falls from the sky. Instead, it will fall onto the street and then get shunted to the storm drains, will just go immediately to the creek. So the ground around it is not being recharged with moisture. There's also like apartment landscapers who are contracted by the apartment complex who come and blow away the leaves all the time. And that is also not good either. So if you want to save the oaks, one thing you can do is to leave the leaves. These leaves are super important. These leaves are slowly broken down by decomposers and they can become rich soil in a couple of years. They also provide great moisture protection that prevents the soil from drying up and baking in the sun. I also mentioned that a lot of oak trees host a lot of insects, different species of insects, especially caterpillars who eventually become moths or butterflies. A lot of people think that, oh, I'll just like, the caterpillars will be in the tree all the time, right? That's really not the case. Like when the caterpillar is ready to pupate or become a cocoon, they usually pupate in the leaf litter. So on the ground in the leaf litter, and they need that leaf litter and that soil type and that humidity and that shelter to pupate to become a moth. If your gardening technique is to just sweep all of these leaves away, we're basically killing off the next generation of caterpillars that will inhabit the oak tree. And so one of the best ways that you can do to kind of bring more habitat, to bring more insect life, is to keep the leaves and let them be. And sometimes an oak can come to you. Nature is in our cities, and we can see that there are trees. That there are birds that distribute seeds. So we have our little scrub jay here who actively caches acorns, which are oak seeds, into the ground. And this year, I've actually seen like 4 oak seedlings come up in my front yard. And yeah, make sure to cherish them because in 100 years, they're going to become big, massive trees that will support life for insects and for birds. And finally, the small things also count. Anything that you do to either reduce your carbon footprint will help birds, will help preserve habitat. And you can also do other small things as well, like keep cats indoors, make sure that they're not hunting the local bird population. Also install bird boxes, but make sure that your area has enough habitat, i.e. food, bird food, insects, for the birds. And yeah, support restoration efforts. Either volunteer with us when the pandemic is over or donate to other organizations who are interested, who are actively conserving birds like Audubon, SFBBO, or us, because we also support the habitat that supports birds. So yeah, in conclusion, to care for birds, we must care about the ecosystem as a whole. The end.
Great, thank you so much, Shelley. I love that we started at Byrne, the small ecosystem, and we expanded out to this call to action. Let's see. So I think we still have a couple more minutes to do some questions. So feel free to put some in the chat and we'll try to get to everyone. We did have some great comments about Douglas Tallamy and his talks and resources about those kind of specialized relationships that Shelley was talking about. It's a great follow-up talk to check out. And if you want to, you can save the chat, so you can save the link. I can also include it in some resources that we'll share. We had a comment about cats killing wild birds, so I'm glad, Shelley, you addressed that, keeping them indoors. All right, let's see. One question from Christine. We have a butterfly bush that has gotten insects that are causing leaves to curl and eating some of the buds before they bloom. Should we let the insects be in case they provide food for birds?
Ooh, yeah. Butterfly bushes are unfortunately not native, and they're becoming an invasive plant. And yeah, they were planted because we thought that they would attract more butterflies. But when we remember about butterflies is that they start out as caterpillars, and caterpillars need specific host plants, which this butterfly bush is not providing. So I think this might not answer your question, but if you want to remove the butterfly bush and instead plant milkweeds or monkey flowers or bee plants instead, I feel like you'll get way more butterflies than that. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent.
Oh, thank you. All right, well, I am not seeing any more questions in the chat, but please feel free to put them in there for the next minute or so.
Hannah, somebody asked if the presentation, well, first said it was an excellent presentation, which it was, and will it be available as a video?
Yes, I think we put in there that it will be posted to our YouTube page, along with where all of our Naturalist talks are there. So you can definitely go back and rewatch or share it with them, with whomever. Let's see. I was gonna just offer to our speakers if they have any final words for the audience. Oh, and well, we have one more question. Is showy milkweed or narrow-leaf milkweed preferred for a yard?
Oh. I know narrow-leaf milkweed is the milkweed that is locally native here. It does require a little bit more water though. Its native habitat is usually near like seepy areas or really close to streams or creeks. The showy milkweed is local to more of the Central Valley, but we do have like some, I'm pretty sure we have a small population here, but they are both well suited for the garden life. The showy milkweed also requires less water.
Nice, thank you. And I missed one question about our nurseries. So how could we influence our local nurseries to carry more true natives? We would all love that. Anyone have suggestions?
Ask them.
Yeah, there was, I remember our former botanist, he told us a story on how it was either California was, the state government was trying to regulate the nursery industry to prevent them from selling invasives. Like we can still go to Home Depot today and buy Algerian ivy, which is not good. But unfortunately, the big nursery lobby has basically convinced our lawmakers that they don't need to be regulated. So I think like on like a statewide change or a national change level, we kind of have to convince our lawmakers that the conservation of our ecosystems are important, and it needs to start kind of at the native plant level.
I want to mention, since, especially since Jean Struthers is in our audience here, that the California Native Plant Society also has a nursery at Hidden Villa, and they sell plants. But they also have an amazing website and a lot of good YouTube videos and presentations. That I saw Douglas Ptolemy present at Foothill College through a symposium they held, and it was fabulous. So check out their resources too. And thank you, Jean, for all the work you've done.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you don't live nearby where we are today, Calscape also has a list of native plant nurseries all throughout California as well. So it's not just limited to us. You can find native plants almost everywhere you travel in California.
Also, one more thing, check out Sustainable Conservation. They have a program called Plant Right, and you can support them to help work with nurseries to stop planting invasive species. They have a really good brochure that's called Don't Plant a Pest.
Nice, yeah, attack from both sides. All right, so I don't want to take us too much farther over, but I do want to say thank you to both our speakers and you, the audience, for your questions and engagement. I hope that we'll see you out at Byrne if possible, but otherwise, you know, just enjoy your time in your local open space, hear the bird songs, start seeing the flowers bloom and those insects buzzing. And I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you again for joining us.